Hi everyone, today you've got me, Harita, and I'm joined with Hayley. How are you going, Hayley?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm good. So today we have got a special guest who a lot of you would know from Parliament. Her name is Vanushi Walters. Her family moved from Sri Lanka to New Zealand in 1987, and she has a background in law and advocacy and has both national and international experience, and she has worked in private practice, the public sector, and also the community sector. So a well-rounded person. Vanushi has held governance roles with Amnesty International, Action for Children and Youth Aotearoa, and is a trustee with Foundation North. She has also held senior management roles as the General Manager of YouthLaw Aotearoa and as the Manager of the Advisory and Research Team at the Human Rights Commission. She was elected as a Member of Parliament for Upper Harbour in 2020 and currently sits as Deputy Chair of the Justice Select Committee, as well as a member of the Regulations Review Committee. She is also the co-chair of the Labour Ethnic Caucus alongside Ibrahim Omar, who is a Labourist MP. Welcome, Vanushi. How are you?
Kia ora, Harita and Hayley. Lovely to be here with you today.
Lovely to have you.
Lovely to have you, especially at such a busy time for you. So I guess we'll get right into it. So like I said at the beginning of your intro, you are of Sri Lankan origin, and you became New Zealand's first Sri Lankan-born MP when you were elected in 2020. Have you ever felt that being the great-granddaughter of Ceylon's second female MP and also coming from Sri Lanka and having that migrant background has helped shape your career in politics?
I grew up hearing stories about Nasim being the second woman in politics, and while that never made me want to be a politician, it did help me, I guess, feel like women could pursue leadership roles in different forums, and that there weren't boundaries, even way back then, for women who really did want to pursue those kinds of careers. For me, being a migrant absolutely had a lot with me wanting to do human rights advocacy work. Again, not necessarily wanting to be a politician, but it was the story my mum told me of Richard de Souza, who was my dad's second cousin, a journalist in Sri Lanka, very prominent and quite vocal about standing up for human rights, knew he was sort of under threat and arranged to leave the country, and then his body was found sort of the next day, really after he went missing. And my mother told me his mother then moved to London and became a really strong Amnesty International advocate. So it was that story that led me to find out more about what was happening in Sri Lanka, but also other countries, and really deciding that I wanted to play a part in advocating for human rights. Yeah.
Oh, it's an unfortunate story, but it's really great to see what you're doing with that. I am sure that your education and previous employment has only helped the transition into your role as Deputy Chair of the Justice. But what kind of challenges and triumphs did you experience as a human rights lawyer, and how has this affected who you are as a politician today?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've had the real privilege of sitting in various different roles, some of them as a human rights lawyer, some of them in a governance and a policy capacity. So one of, I think, the roles that will always stay with me is when I was on the International Board of Amnesty. I was there for about 6 years and got to do some of the paperwork side of things, so pushing human rights policy and reform. But the parts that meant the most to me were when I was on the ground. So I had the great privilege of being in Nepal twice, and taking part in women's rights protests in Kathmandu and in Pokhara as well. And then I was in Mongolia and the Philippines, where I was assisting the board and the senior staff of Amnesty and those organisations to do governance and management planning. And again, I think I just I learned so much about one, how complex it is in some countries to fight for human rights when your own human rights are directly at risk, but also how privileged we are here in Aotearoa that we can raise some of these issues in such safety, and we can genuinely debate these issues without having to worry about going, underground to raise them.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. I just saw something on Facebook today about how a journalist has been put in prison. I can't remember what country, but it was on the Amnesty International Facebook page.
Yeah.
I think she's a single mother of 2 kids and she's a journalist. So I'm assuming she was reporting in one of these countries where you don't have freedom of speech. And that just, raises exactly what you said. Like, we actually live in a country where, okay, freedom of speech will have issues here and there, but you'll never be put in jail because you've expressed your opinion.
Exactly. And I think, one of the great privileges for me in this role is that parts of my role sometimes feel very much like what I used to do with Amnesty. So I'm the chair of what's called the Interparliamentary Union for this parliament. And it means we go to 2 meetings a year, talk to other parliamentarians about issues like climate change, human rights, etc. But a core part of the IPU's work is to identify politicians whose human rights are at risk because of the issues they're raising in their home countries, and then to try and demand accountability across our colleague circles at those meetings, so that those individuals are given their rights to fair process and, the basics if they're in prison. Yeah.
So I guess leading on from that, what have been some of the challenges and highlights in your career since you've been elected in 2020?
Wow. There have been a lot. As you said, I sit as the chair of the Justice Select Committee. When I was the deputy chair, we passed the conversion practices, or the prohibition of conversion practices bill. And so that came through Justice, and we had one of the highest numbers of submissions for that bill. So we had to split into various subcommittees. And I think for me, the cathartic nature of going through that very long, detailed process and having difficult conversations with New Zealanders from all walks of life, but then seeing it pass through the House as well and being part of a key human rights bill through all those processes really meant a huge amount to me. Another one would be at the IPU I mentioned. I was in Rwanda in October last year, and Ukraine asked me to be one of their drafters on an emergency resolution discussion. And so it ended up being sort of a room of 8 countries, and New Zealand was one, and I had the privilege of being in that room. And I'll always remember when that emergency resolution was passed on the floor, which we didn't think was possible because Russia was there in big numbers as well. One of the Ukrainians sort of rushed over and hugged me and said, Ukraine on its own can't do this, but Ukraine with friends, we can. And that was incredibly powerful for me. Another moment was actually very early on when we were all being sworn in and we all had to give our our maiden speeches. At the first batch of maiden speeches, there was a huge group of new MPs, many of whom had young children. And it was just something else to see these kids running through the halls of Parliament, this really diverse group of kids. And I sort of thought to myself, one, what a privilege, but only in New Zealand as well do we have a Parliament like this. And I think that is probably the first time I came down off my election night high, sort of I'm a new MP high, and went, we've got so much to deliver for these young people. So much of my career has been about children's rights and working for children and young people. And I think at that moment, the weight of what we had to do was really in front of me. Yeah.
I think that's really sweet. Having kids in Parliament kind of reminds you what you're working for as well. As we do head into another election, what are your campaign promises, and are there any issues in particular that you're passionate about combating next term?
Well, that is a great question. And so Labor hasn't yet released our manifesto to the public. We're sort of working on the last aspects of finalising it now. So I won't speak to that, but what I will speak to is what I see as our focus going into the campaign period, and really you can see it from the last budget. So the last budget was Labor's 5th wellbeing budget, and for me that word wellbeing is everything that Labor is about, putting people first. And we've done that in terms of the COVID response, we've done that in terms of the emergency response, and we're doing that in terms of addressing the cost of living and community safety issues, which every time I speak to people, those are probably the two things that really come to the fore, with cost of living really being echoed across the country. And the times I've felt really proud in the last few months talking about the budget have been when I've been talking to school principals who always use the same two words whenever they talk to me. I've been into Rotorua Girls High and schools across Upper Harbour, my electorate. They always say it is a game changer that we have free lunches in schools. Not only are kids turning up who stopped turning up for a while, but they're there to learn and they're paying attention. They say that it's a game changer that we've got free period products in schools, because again, there were young girls not turning up who now can. And these things that seem so little are so huge for people. I spoke to a pharmacist in Massey who said after we removed the $5 co-payment on prescription fees, that he saw people coming in to pick up their prescriptions who had never come in, who lived in the area, who'd never come in to pick up their prescriptions before. So I think it's about addressing the cost of living and the things that seem little but are so huge to people's everyday lives.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Like you were saying, you know, a prescription cost is $5, which to a lot of people is not much, but then to some people, like that $5 could be make or break whether they have a meal that, you know, for dinner or not. I guess, like, moving on from that, as a minority woman inside New Zealand's government, which actually there's a few now, which is really good to see, but what has been your experience, and do you think that women and people of colour receive a fair representation by the media and your peers in Parliament?
A lot in that question.
Yep.
So in terms of treatment in the House, I'd say this. In the House, people are much more respectful of each other than I think the media portrays. So one of the reasons I never wanted to get into politics was because I had this perception that it was all sort of fisticuffs and hate, and no one was looking at the real issues. And that is not true. There's a lot of collegiality across the House. And I've certainly felt respected not only by my peers within my caucus, but across the floor as well. I've got some really good working relationships. What I didn't expect was how complex an environment it would be online. And to be quite honest, I probably didn't consider that almost at all before stepping into the role. And so that's been a real eye-opener for me. And over the course of the term, I've actually gotten to know the staff at the Disinformation Project who work out of Otago University really well, because they have exceptional data about what's happening online and some of the hate that we're seeing bubbling to the top. And certainly for me, that has been a thing that happens from time to time, more often direct messaging rather than it being in a public space, I've found. And so I think you decide to what extent you share that with colleagues and when you feel that you need to report things to the police, etc., which I have done on occasion. And I think in terms of the public, what I've found is face-to-face interactions for the most part, not all, are quite respectful. So even if there are elements of not quite appropriate suggestions, I'd say, I think it's often done in a way that's intended to be kind. So examples of that are, I've had people suggest that I should bring my Pākehā husband along with me to various meetings so that they can see that actually I'm really just like them. I've had people suggest that I change my name to something that's slightly more slightly easier to pronounce.
Vanushi's not
and
even that hard to pronounce.
I know. And my all-time favourite was on the campaign trail last time around, when I'd be in the same forums as men who also had children about the same age, and I'd be asked who's looking after the kids, and my male counterparts wouldn't be asked any of that. So there are still elements of that, but I think what keeps me really grounded and focused is that with my peers, with colleagues, there is a huge amount of respect in the house, despite what you see in the media. Yeah.
Oh, that's it's really great to hear. It kind of answers the question I was already going to ask you regarding racism and sexism and the media and the public. But how has things changed in Parliament now that you have so many females in the seats? Do you feel like the trajectory of Parliament has changed? Is sexism dropping? Did it ever really feel like an issue in the first place?
I think I've been really privileged because I've come into a cohort where more than 50% of Labour's caucus were women. And I came in where a large number of us coming in were new. So there's been a lot of support on the backbench for me, and with more senior colleagues as well. And within Labour, we meet as a women's caucus every sitting block to talk about the issues affecting women in New Zealand and also how we're doing as women parliamentarians. So that support's been fantastic. But I must say, it sort of hit me when we were doing, you remember when Parliament got to 50-50 women in Parliament, we had this wonderful photo op with former women MPs who came into Parliament, and we're all standing there waiting in the lobby for our photo to be taken. And one of the former women MPs leant over and said to me, like I was in my happy place, and she said, did you know that 2/3 of the women who've ever been in Parliament are in Parliament now?
Oh, wow.
Wow.
I know. And I sort of like bubble burst. and I sort of just thought, this is so young. Like it's incredibly powerful, because you don't get to a place where you have free period products in school and, you know, the government matching KiwiSaver contributions when women take maternity leave if you don't have women in these roles. But it is young, and I do think we need to continue to take steps to ensure that women feel like Parliament is a place for them. But we're working on it, and I think some of the little changes have been big. An example of a little change was the former Speaker Trevor Mallard decided that parliamentary sitting blocks would never happen during the school holiday breaks in the year, so that we'd always be back in our electorates when the kids were also on break. We were still working, but at least you'd be around in the evenings and that sort of thing, and it's made a huge difference. And the babies who've been in Parliament, several of my colleagues have had wee babies, and they've all been very welcome. There are parent rooms, and the babies come into the debating chamber as well. You've probably seen a few photos of some babies sitting on the former Speaker's knee during question time. So it's undoubtable that Parliament has significantly changed, but I do think we need to ensure we protect what we've got. And we need to share what we're doing with other countries who aren't yet there. So at the end of next week, the 11 women MPs who are MPs in Sri Lanka are actually coming to New Zealand, and I'm hosting them at a few events here. They chose New Zealand because we're showing that you can put in place systems and architecture to grow women's voices in political space.
Wow, that's so good to hear. So I guess, like, on that note, which is not one of the questions we were going to ask you, but what is the relationship between New Zealand Parliament and the Sri Lankan Parliament? If they've, I'm assuming the relationship must be good if they've seen this as an opportunity to actually come here and learn.
Yeah, so the Speaker's role is, a large part of the Speaker's role is to ensure that we're engaging with other parliaments. So he will frequently set up Zoom calls and host delegations here as well, so that we're engaging with all sorts of different parliaments. as the IPU chair, my role is to do something similar, especially when I'm overseas at those meetings, so engaging with the delegations, which are always cross-party delegations. I have been on a call before with the Sri Lankan speaker and our former speaker, and so this is sort of the next step for us. We do also have a High Commissioner on the ground in Colombo, and so he helps to facilitate the relationship as well. But I mean, I do think next week's visit is going to be very special because, you know, it's all of the cross-party women, but they're a very small number in terms of the total seats in Sri Lanka, which is 200 plus. So I'm keen for us to have an ongoing relationship with them as they look to make some changes.
Yeah. So I guess, like, in terms of you getting into politics and having that career change, how did your friends and family react when you decided that you originally wanted to campaign all those years ago? And were they supportive of your decision to get into politics?
Yes, they unanimous. I mean, across the board, friends and family really were. When I first got into politics, it was purely to be involved with policy drafting, though. So I never had any intention when I joined the party of standing to be an MP. I just really loved the idea of doing policy work behind the scenes. And I got involved because I was the general manager of YouthLaw Aotearoa, and this young backbencher used to come and visit us, you know, every year almost. And she had the youth portfolio, and it was Jacinda. And I was always really impressed with her knowledge, but also the way she treated everyone in the room. So from my interns to the lawyers to the board members, everyone's voices mattered. So when she became leader, I volunteered to do policy work for the party. And then the decision to stand was very different. There were a lot of family discussions at the time. My youngest would have been 3, I think. And as I was speaking to a few of our senior party folk who suggested I might like to do this, we were at my dining table, and my 3-year-old fell asleep under the table. And I pointed and I sort of said, look, there's no way I can do this. Just look under the table. This is my current reality. And so I think for me, the idea of doing this seemed completely, it didn't really seem like an option at all. So it did take a lot of conversations, not just with family and friends, but with current MPs who had young families, to get a sense of how they made it work as well. But once we made the decision, they've been very supportive. I really could not do this, especially without my husband and my mum's support. We are really a little village, and I have mother-in-laws who are fantastic as well. So it is a village support situation.
Yeah, I'm sure he throws in a few dad jokes every now and then when you need a little bit of humor in your life.
Absolutely. And I've got to say, that's probably the other thing. My husband and my 3 boys all have a great sense of humor. Absolutely essential if you have a family member in politics.
Yeah, especially in a serious career path such as this, eh?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
What are your observations when you think about the political environment for women, particularly minority females in New Zealand? And what would your advice be for young women considering this career path?
My advice would be to speak to others who are doing it about their experience. Don't make it one person either. I think I had the privilege of being able to speak to several different people, all of whom had slightly different experiences. And then really be sure of your why when you're coming into politics. To be quite honest, I still struggle to see myself as a politician. I'm always really comfortable seeing myself as a human rights advocate who in the past has practiced law, has done policy work, has done activism, and now I'm doing politics, and I may be doing something else another day. I absolutely love my job, and I do want to stay here, but be very clear about your why, and the values which sit around your why before you come in, I'd say. I do think it's entirely possible for women of all backgrounds and ages as well. We have the young Nacy Chen with us, for example. But I do think you have to have good support systems at home, and you need to know your why. You also need to have strategies to deal with the pressures that come in this day and age in politics. And part of that is having a strategy of how you're going to manage your online profile, and what you are and aren't going to do in that space. Yeah.
Is there anything in particular besides politics and human rights that you like to do just to wind down, to forget about the pressure on your plate?
Well, one hobby. Ooh, I'm currently in my apartment at the moment, and I've got a guitar here as well as one up.
Oh.
I won't play anything for you, but I do think just like music, I absolutely love music. So if you're in our house in West Auckland, we've got like a piano, a guitar, multiple ukuleles, a banjo, a mandolin, like just everything, like a cajon. So music is a big one. I've got a mountain bike as well, so biking with the kids is always fun. But to be quite honest, anything with the kids, like whether it's playing board games or, going to jump, or I had the best night the other night coming home we opened a campaigning office in the North Shore, and I made it to the Matariki disco for the last song, which was Barbie Girl, and the kids were just going off, like the little mosh pit going on. And it was just a joy. And although it was only about 10 minutes that I was there for, it was just fantastic. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. Do you make a point to teach your kids about politics or the career that you're in?
Yeah, I do. And they've watched, so if you haven't yet, Parliamentary Services make these awesome, very short videos about the parliamentary process. And they're really suitable for, in my view, all ages. So my kids have watched those, and of course they've been around Parliament with me, and they watch Parliament TV from time to time, to the point where my youngest, when he was 5 years old, I can't remember what I said at the dinner table, but he said, "Stand, withdraw, and apologise." That's what the speaker says. So yeah, I like them to know not only what I do, but frequently the tough decisions that we're having to make, and the arguments on both sides when we have to make those decisions. I used to in the past play what I call the equity game with them, where I'd get them to do an obstacle course, but certain people would have advantages and disadvantages, and then we'd talk about the politics of that. And it was, they weren't super happy with it at the beginning, but I think once they got
Do they watch any of your videos in parliaments where you're talking or anything like that?
I believe they do, because I'm occasionally quoted back. My eldest is 12, and has quite a strong political voice himself. So I don't know if I'm his favourite politician, though. He's quite the fan.
Yeah.
He's quite the fan of Chloe.
I think it was your maiden speech that I was watching recently. You were talking about how you walk around barefoot a lot of the time. Did your family tease you a bit about that one?
Well, strangely, my family walk around barefoot way more than I do, to the point where my younger two refuse to wear shoes in Parliament. And the poor security guard, we tried to get into the gallery to watch the youth MPs, and they wouldn't let us in. And he said, "I'm so sorry, the rules are that you kids need to have shoes on." So yeah, they would all go without shoes for the rest of their lives, I'm sure. For me, I'm actually mostly a shoe person, strangely, at home. What I did was I started not wearing shoes going to work when I went to YouthLaw, and when we moved the offices from the city to South Auckland, I used to walk around the blocks without shoes, just sort of to get a feel for the place, because I was so used to working elsewhere. And for me, it made quite a difference in terms of encouraging me to be physically present, as opposed to being in my head thinking about the issues. So that's a good reminder that I should probably do that again this week.
I thought that whole speech was great. You were really descriptive with your emotions as well. You were really telling a story. I really love listening to it. I guess maybe if you do come into office, then your next policy could be a no shoes policy, so more of you can have that involvement.
Absolutely.
I wanted to
are-
ask. I wanted to ask a bit of a question about the online presence that you were talking about earlier. So obviously, you know, now there's so many more keyboard warriors than there were before. But how do you think the online, I guess, bullying and things differ to women than it does for men? Like, I know earlier this year, Jacinda Ardern saw a lot of backlash when she decided to step down. And I remember thinking, like, if it was a man in her position, he wouldn't have got all the type of comments that she did about standing down. So, like, how have you noticed that difference?
Yeah, I think maybe again it comes back to how young having the strong presence of women in politics is. When you're here, you can take it so much for granted because there are so many women who I interact with on the political floor every week. But actually, for us as a society, it's still very, very young. And so I think part of it is that it feels distinctly new to many people. But I also think it's what's happened online is a conflation of that. So the young piece in terms of women newly in the last sort of 30 years odd coming into these roles, the conflation of that with COVID and the rise in mis and disinformation and the birth of social media as a mechanism to spread those ideas. So a few of my colleagues at the Disinformation Project will monitor things like Telegram, which is obviously a space where hate is really prolific. And they'll talk about this idea of whack-a-mole. So it's not that there's an anti-women sentiment, there's an anti-government sentiment, there's an anti-organisation sentiment, and it manifests in different ways. So at its peak, it could be anti-COVID, and if that dies down, then it becomes something about, you know, anti-census, don't fill in your census forms, and then it becomes an anti-something else. And so for me, I think at the beginning of the term, when we were going through COVID, I was very worried about the spread of disinformation about COVID. Now I'm very worried about what appears to be this slightly whack-a-mole type behaviour in the online space. Anti-women in leadership roles is a part of that, but I'm less worried about that as a subject matter as opposed to the pattern that we're seeing, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Hopefully it starts to get a bit better, rather than like going down the path it's going. It's not going a good way if it continues this way.
No, and I think now we've got data on exactly what's happening. The next question is, so what? So what do we do about that? And how do you regulate the online space in a way that still maintains the integrity of our free speech values? Because for me, the reason I got into human rights work was all about free speech. It was the journalists who were being tortured and disappeared in Sri Lanka and their right to be saying something about that. So I hold free speech in very high regard. I'm also someone who thinks we need to be extremely cautious about curbing that. However, we do already curb it in various ways. And so the question is, how do we accommodate for this new social media online space in a regulatory way? And it's not, sometimes it seems too big and that we'll never be able to do it. But we have to also remember that there was a time at which books weren't published and distributed in the way that they did become published and distributed. And we had no law to regulate that. But eventually our laws evolved so that we were able to regulate that in a safe way and protect intellectual property and other rights in that space as well.
Oh, I'd love to see what Labor can bring in to help maintain some free speech, but also look after us online, because I've seen it get far worse over time as well. It seems like there's a general type of population too, like you said, they jump from one thing to another, where it's COVID, census, they're just I'm not entirely sure what it is or what kind of makes that person, but the online space has given them an opportunity to become quite loud.
Yeah, absolutely.
We are actually coming to the close to the interview today, but before we draw this conversation to an end, is there anything else either of you would like to discuss?
I mean, maybe just from me, I think when I talk to people at the moment, it's true that people often raise cost of living, community safety issues, the war, and there seems to be some fatigue still in terms of post-COVID issues. Yes, all of that is happening, but there's still so much to be hopeful for. I've got a youth advisory group in Upper Harbour, and they are so engaged and so onto it and pitching solutions in terms of the role New Zealand can play in addressing climate change, the lobbying we should be doing, the seeds we should be planting in terms of some of the key relationships internationally. And I think sometimes we forget that we've got this creative genius and these layers of young people who do have ideas and a true commitment in terms of protecting our values. And I think we also sometimes forget that New Zealand has historically led on a lot of the big issues that have tackled the world, and we're seen as a moral champion in a large number of these spaces. So it's a challenging time, but I do believe that there's promise ahead and that New Zealand's got a big role to play in terms of some of those big issues.
Oh, I can't wait to see what Labour come out with. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Is there anything else you'd like to say, Harita?
No, I think you've covered a lot of like positive thoughts about what you stand for, which is exactly why we wanted to interview you. I guess now that you go into your election campaigning time, I think I saw something last week about it's officially 90 days. I wish you all the best of luck, and hopefully you don't get too stressed out during the campaign time, and have some downtime with your family as well.
Thank you both. It's been a real pleasure to speak to you both.
Oh, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Yeah, you're great. You have a great energy. It was awesome to chat. Thank you.
Thank you.